In the quiet countryside of Colbert County, Alabama, Elizabeth Sennett fought for her life with everything she had. The 45-year-old grandmother and pastor's wife wasn't going to give up without a fight. Her attackers had beaten her with a fireplace poker, a walking cane, and a piece of galvanized pipe. They had stabbed her 8 times in the chest and twice in the neck. Her face was so brutally disfigured that a family friend, who arrived at the crime scene and is also an emergency medical technician who had known her for years, wouldn't have recognized her. But Elizabeth Sennett was still alive. When medical technicians arrived at the scene on that March evening in 1988, they struggled to find a pulse. The EMTs worked frantically. Sheriff Ronnie May arrived at the scene, and the crime scene first looked like a home invasion gone wrong. Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, and she fought hard for her life. But despite her incredible will to survive, the injuries were too severe. She died at the hospital, leaving behind a family, a community, and a mystery that would challenge investigators for weeks to come.
You are watching True Crime Lens.
Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett lived the kind of life that small-town Alabama communities respected. She was a devoted wife to Reverend Charles Sennett Sr., a minister in the Church of Christ. She was a loving mother and grandmother who opened her home to anyone in need. In Colbert County, where everyone knew everyone, Elizabeth represented stability, faith, and kindness. The Sennett home sat in the countryside, surrounded by the peaceful quiet that Charles had often remarked upon. It was the kind of place where neighbors were few and far between, where visitors were rare, and where a woman might feel safe spending her days alone while her husband tended to his congregation. But on March 18, 1988, that isolation would become Elizabeth's nightmare. When law enforcement arrived at the Sennett home that evening, Sheriff Ronnie May immediately sensed something was wrong. The house looked like it had been ransacked, but there was something off about the scene. Drawers were pulled out, items were scattered, but the chaos seemed deliberate. A video cassette recorder was missing from the living room. A stereo had been taken. These were the classic signs of a burglary, but May had investigated dozens of break-ins over the years. This didn't feel like the work of opportunistic thieves looking for quick cash. The violence against Elizabeth was extreme, far beyond what investigators would expect in a simple robbery gone wrong. The brutality suggested something personal, something driven by more than just the desire to steal a few electronics. Investigators began their preliminary examination of the scene. The staging was too obvious, too theatrical. Real burglars didn't usually take time to create such elaborate disorder. They grabbed what they could and left quickly. This looked like someone trying very hard to make it appear like a burglary. Charles Sennett appeared to be devastated by his wife's condition. As Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, still clinging to life, the Reverend seemed overcome with grief and shock. But Sheriff May, trained to observe human behavior in crisis situations, noticed something unusual. When the EMTs announced they had found a pulse, Charles almost collapsed. At first glance, it might have seemed like relief, but May sensed something different. The reaction seemed wrong somehow, as if Charles had been expecting different news. May filed this observation away in his mind. In murder investigations, especially those involving family members, every detail mattered. Every reaction, every word, every gesture could be significant. The sheriff also remembered something else about Charles Sennett. Just weeks before Elizabeth's murder, Charles had shown up at another crime scene where May was investigating. The Reverend had no business being there, and May had to repeatedly ask him to leave. At the time, it had seemed like simple curiosity, but now May wondered if there was more to it. With Elizabeth's death confirmed at the hospital, the investigation shifted into high gear. The first priority was securing the crime scene and conducting a thorough forensic examination. Every piece of evidence would need to be cataloged, every surface dusted for fingerprints, every room searched for clues. The missing items were noted carefully. The VCR and stereo were valuable to interest burglars, but investigators noticed something odd. The VCR was gone, but its remote control remained behind. Most thieves would either take both items or leave both behind. Taking a VCR without its remote suggested someone unfamiliar with how the system worked, or someone in a hurry. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, though in rural Colbert County, neighbors were scarce. The few people they spoke with hadn't seen anything unusual, hadn't noticed any strange cars or unfamiliar faces in the area. The isolation that had made the Sennett home a peaceful retreat had also made it the perfect place for a crime with no witnesses. As the investigation continued, detectives began looking more closely at the people in Elizabeth's life. In most murder cases, the victim knows their killer. Random violence, while frightening, is actually relatively rare. The staging of the crime scene, along with the sheer brutality of the act, only reinforced their suspicion that this wasn't a random burglary. Charles Sennett was cooperative with investigators, answering their questions and providing information about Elizabeth's routine, her friends, and anyone who might have had access to their home. As the victim's husband, he was naturally someone investigators would want to speak with extensively, but initially there was no reason to suspect him of involvement. The Reverend explained that Elizabeth had been home alone that evening, as was often the case when he had church duties. He had returned to find the house in chaos and his wife brutally injured. His story was consistent and seemed believable. But investigators were trained to look beyond the obvious. They began examining the Sennett's finances, their relationship, and their recent activities. What they discovered would begin to shift the focus of their investigation. The picture that emerged of the Sennett family's finances was troubling. Charles Sennett was drowning in debt, far deeper than anyone in the community realized. The respected Reverend had borrowed money he couldn't repay, and his financial problems were mounting by the day. But investigators discovered something else that raised red flags. Charles had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Elizabeth. The timing was suspicious, and the amount was significant. For a man facing financial ruin, his wife's death would provide a windfall that could solve his problems. Still, many people take out life insurance policies on their spouses. It wasn't unusual or necessarily suspicious on its own. But combined with the staged crime scene and Charles's unusual behavior, it was another piece of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Investigators also began hearing rumors about Charles's personal life. There were whispers about an affair, about the respected minister straying from his marriage vows. If true, it would provide another motive beyond the financial incentive. The investigation had been methodical, but was moving slowly. Then, on March 25th, exactly 1 week after Elizabeth's murder, investigators received a phone call that would change everything. The call came into Crime Stoppers, and the anonymous caller had information that made Detective Harold Carson sit up and take notice. The caller claimed to know who had killed Elizabeth Sennett, and the details they provided were incredibly specific. The caller named 3 names: Billy Gray Williams, Kenneth Smith, and John Parker. But it wasn't just the names that convinced Carson the tip was genuine. The caller provided details that only someone with inside knowledge could know. According to the caller, Williams lived in a property owned by Charles Sennett. The 3 men had attended Coffee High School together and were close friends. The murder had originally been planned for Wednesday, but was postponed because Elizabeth had a doctor's appointment. But the most convincing detail was this. The caller knew about the missing VCR. A Samsung VCR had been stolen from the Sennett home and was now at Smith's house. And here was the crucial part. The remote control was missing. This information hadn't been released to the public. Only the killers and the investigators knew about the missing remote. The tip was genuine, and it gave investigators the breakthrough they desperately needed. Carson immediately began verifying the information from the anonymous tip. He discovered that Billy Gray Williams did indeed live in a property owned by Charles Sennett. The connection between the victim's husband and one of the named suspects was the first concrete link investigators had found. Further investigation revealed that Williams, Smith, and Parker had all attended Coffee High School together and remained close friends. The caller's information was checked out, detail by detail, but the most important verification would come from searching Smith's residence. If the stolen VCR was there, investigators would have physical evidence linking the suspects to the crime scene. Carson began preparing a search warrant, knowing that this could be the key to solving Elizabeth Sennett's murder. On March 31st, 1988, just 13 days after Elizabeth's murder, Carson executed a search warrant at Kenneth Smith's residence. The search was methodical and thorough, and investigators knew exactly what they were looking for. They found it. The Samsung VCR from the Sennett home was sitting in Smith's living room, just as the anonymous caller had claimed. It was the crucial piece of physical evidence that would link Smith directly to the crime scene and prove that the burglary had been staged. The discovery of the VCR was the smoking gun investigators needed. Combined with the other information from the anonymous tip, they now had probable cause to arrest all three suspects. Later that same afternoon, in a coordinated effort, all three suspects were arrested. Billy Gray Williams, Kenneth Smith, and John Parker were taken into custody and transported to the Colbert County Sheriff's Department for questioning. The speed of the arrests was remarkable. In less than 2 weeks, investigators had gone from a staged crime scene with no clear suspects to having 3 men in custody with physical evidence linking them to the crime. But arrests were just the beginning. Now, investigators needed to build a case that would hold up in court. They needed confessions, they needed to understand the motive, and they needed to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy that had led to Elizabeth Sennett's brutal murder. Under questioning, the three suspects began to reveal the truth about what had happened on March 18th. The interrogations were conducted separately, with each man telling his version of events. Kenneth Smith was the first to break. He admitted his involvement in Elizabeth's death, though he claimed his intent wasn't to kill her. According to Smith, he had only wanted to beat her up and rough her up to make it look like a robbery. But the evidence told a different story. 8 stab wounds to the chest and 2 to the neck suggested something far more lethal than a simple beating. John Parker corroborated Smith's account, filling in details about how they had gained entry to the Sennett home and how the attack had unfolded. The 2 men had told Elizabeth they were there to survey the property for hunting, with her husband's permission. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators learned about the man who had orchestrated the entire plot. Through the interrogations, investigators discovered that Billy Gray Williams had been recruited by someone else to arrange Elizabeth's murder. Williams had been approached by someone who wanted his wife dead and was willing to pay for it. That someone was Charles Sennett. The respected Reverend, the grieving widower who had appeared so devastated by his wife's death, had been the architect of the entire conspiracy. He had approached Williams, his tenant, with a proposition. Kill Elizabeth and make it look like a burglary, and there would be money in it for everyone involved. The motive was exactly what investigators had suspected: money and freedom. Charles was drowning in debt, and Elizabeth's life insurance policy would provide the cash he needed. Adding to this, Charles was having an affair and wanted to be free of his marriage without the scandal and financial burden of a divorce. Williams had recruited Smith and Parker to help carry out the murder. Each man was promised $1,000 for the job. Charles had even provided money for them to buy a gun, wanting the murder to be quick and clean. But Smith and Parker had other plans for the money. They spent it on drugs instead, which meant they had to improvise weapons when the time came to kill Elizabeth. Armed with the confessions and the physical evidence, investigators were ready to confront Charles Sennett. On March 25th, exactly 1 week after his wife's murder, Charles was brought in for questioning. The Reverend maintained his innocence throughout most of the interview. He denied any involvement in Elizabeth's death, claiming he was as shocked and devastated as anyone else. He played the role of the grieving widower convincingly. But then investigators mentioned Kenneth Smith's name. Charles's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed red, a visible physiological response that investigators noted carefully. His demeanor shifted, and it was clear that Smith's name meant something significant to him. Despite this reaction, Charles continued to deny his involvement. He was allowed to leave after the questioning, but investigators knew they had rattled him. The net was closing, and Charles Sennett knew it. What happened next shocked even the seasoned investigators who had been working the case. Charles Sennett drove straight from the police station to his church, where he called an emergency meeting with his sons and their families. What he told them in that church would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Charles confessed to having an affair. He confessed to being deeply in debt. And most shocking of all, he confessed to arranging for their mother to be killed. The respected reverend, the man who had preached about morality and faith from the pulpit, admitted to his own children that he had orchestrated their mother's brutal murder for money and his own selfish desires. After his confession to his family, Charles walked out to the church parking lot. He got into his truck, pulled out a gun, and ended his own life. Taking his own life was his final confession. Unable to face the consequences of his actions, unable to live with the guilt of what he had done, he chose death over accountability. His death confirmed what investigators had suspected and what the interrogations had revealed. The grieving widower had been the mastermind behind his wife's murder. He had coldly calculated that Elizabeth's death would solve his financial problems and free him to pursue his affair. But Charles had underestimated the brutality of the men he had hired. What he had envisioned as a quick, clean killing had turned into a savage beating and stabbing that left Elizabeth fighting for her life for hours. The irony was cruel. Charles had wanted to escape his problems through Elizabeth's death, but in the end, those same problems had driven him to take his own life. With Charles Sennett dead and the 3 hired killers in custody, the focus shifted to ensuring that justice was served for Elizabeth. The legal proceedings would span years and would highlight some of the most controversial aspects of Alabama's capital punishment system. Billy Gray Williams was the first to face trial in January 1989. He was charged with capital murder, specifically murder done for pecuniary consideration or pursuant to a contract for hire. Despite not being present during the actual beating and stabbing, prosecutors argued that Williams had actively recruited Smith and Parker and had facilitated the murder. Williams was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in a state correctional facility in November 2020, more than 30 years after Elizabeth's murder. Kenneth Smith and John Parker would face more complex legal proceedings that would become the subject of national attention and controversy. Both Kenneth Smith and John Parker were convicted of capital murder and faced the possibility of death sentences. But their cases would highlight one of the most controversial aspects of Alabama's justice system: judicial override. John Parker's jury, despite being composed of individuals who supported the death penalty, voted 10-2 to recommend life in prison without parole. They had heard evidence about Parker's intellectual limitations, his problems with impulse control, his youth at the time of the offense, and his lack of significant criminal history. But the trial judge disregarded the jury's recommendation and sentenced Parker to death anyway. Kenneth Smith faced trial twice. His first conviction in 1989 was overturned due to the unconstitutional striking of black jurors by the prosecution. In his second trial in 1996, the jury voted overwhelmingly 11-1 to recommend life imprisonment without parole. Once again, the judge overrode the jury's recommendation and imposed a death sentence. John Parker was executed by lethal injection in June 2010, despite appeals arguing that the judge had improperly overridden the jury's verdict. Kenneth Smith's path to execution would be far more controversial. After more than 30 years on death row, Alabama attempted to execute him by lethal injection in November 2022. The execution was botched, with officials unable to find a suitable vein for 4 hours, subjecting Smith to what many called torture. Following the failed execution, Alabama decided to use an untested method, nitrogen hypoxia. The process involved administering pure nitrogen gas through a mask to deprive Smith of oxygen. It had never been used for human execution anywhere in the world. On January 25, 2024, Kenneth Smith became the first person in history to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia. The execution drew international condemnation and reignited debates about capital punishment and the search for humane methods of execution. The Elizabeth Sennett murder case spanned over 3 decades, from that brutal night in March 1988 to Kenneth Smith's controversial execution in January 2024. It was a case that began with a husband's betrayal and ended with questions about the very nature of justice itself. Elizabeth Sennett was a woman who deserved to grow old with her grandchildren, to see her sons succeed in life, to continue serving her community with the faith and kindness that defined her character. Instead, she became the victim of a conspiracy driven by greed and selfishness. The investigation that followed her murder showcased both the best and worst of the American justice system. Dedicated investigators like Sheriff Ronnie May and Detective Harold Carson worked tirelessly to solve the case, following leads and evidence to bring Elizabeth's killers to justice. The anonymous tip that broke the case open demonstrated how community involvement can be crucial in solving crimes. But the case also highlighted serious flaws in how justice is administered. The judicial override system that sent Smith and Parker to death row, despite jury recommendations for life imprisonment, was eventually abolished in Alabama, but not before it had affected hundreds of cases. The botched execution attempt and subsequent use of an experimental execution method raised profound questions about what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and whether the state can ever truly carry out executions humanely. For Elizabeth's family, the journey was bittersweet. Her son Michael had forgiven all 3 perpetrators years before Smith's execution, understanding that holding on to anger wouldn't bring his mother back. When Smith was finally executed, Michael described feeling that his mother had received justice, but also acknowledged that nothing could truly compensate for their loss. Elizabeth Sennett's story reminds us that behind every crime statistic is a real person with a real life, real dreams, and real people who loved them. Her murder was brutal, but her fight for life was inspiring. Even in her final moments, Elizabeth fought with everything she had. The case will continue to be studied and debated as society grapples with questions of justice, punishment, and redemption. If this story moved you or made you think deeply about justice, betrayal, and redemption, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the truth behind the headlines. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. Thanks for watching.